The winter of 1953 had been particularly brutal in the mountains of West Virginia, but nothing could have prepared the residents of Pine Ridge for what they discovered that February morning. When the first responders finally reached the burned remains of the Hartwell family farmhouse, they found something that would haunt the community for decades to come. 5 little girls, ages ranging from 4 to 14, huddled together in the root cellar beneath their destroyed home. Their parents were gone, claimed by the same house fire that had consumed everything they had ever known. But these sisters had survived 3 days in the frozen darkness, the eldest keeping the youngest alive through sheer determination and a fierce protective love that defied their desperate circumstances. What no one in Pine Ridge could have predicted was that their salvation would come from the most unlikely source: a broken man living in complete isolation on the mountain above their town. A former soldier who had convinced himself that he had nothing left to offer the world. The meeting between Marcus Sullivan and the Hartwell sisters would challenge everything both he and the community believed about redemption, family, and the unexpected ways that healing can emerge from the deepest wounds. This is the story of how 5 orphaned girls transformed a man who had given up on himself, and how their unlikely bond would ultimately reshape an entire community's understanding of what it means to be family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Sullivan had been living alone on Copper Mountain for 8 months when the Hartwell house burned down, though the people of Pine Ridge below had largely forgotten he existed. The ramshackle cabin he called home sat 3 miles up a barely passable dirt road, surrounded by dense pine forests that provided the isolation he craved and the invisibility he desperately needed. At 32 years old, Marcus carried himself like a much older man, his shoulders permanently hunched as if bearing an invisible weight that never left him. The limp in his left leg was pronounced enough that locals had noticed it during his rare trips to town for supplies. But what they couldn't see were the deeper wounds that had driven him to seek refuge in the mountains of West Virginia. The cabin itself was a testament to Marcus's desire to disappear from the world. Built sometime in the 1920s by a long-dead moonshiner, it had been abandoned for decades before Marcus had discovered it during one of his aimless wanderings through the Appalachian wilderness. The roof leaked in 3 places, the wood-burning stove smoked when the wind shifted, and the well water had a metallic taste that reminded him uncomfortably of things he preferred not to remember. But it was his, in the sense that no one else wanted it, and it was far enough from civilization that he could go weeks without seeing another human being. After what he had experienced in Korea, such isolation felt like a luxury rather than a hardship. The Korean War had ended 6 months before Marcus retreated to Copper Mountain, but for him, the fighting had never really stopped. The nightmares came with such regularity that he had given up trying to prevent them, instead organizing his life around their inevitable arrival. He slept in short bursts, never more than 2 or 3 hours at a time, and he had developed an elaborate system of tasks and routines designed to keep his mind occupied during the long hours when sleep was impossible. Marcus spent his days chopping wood with an obsessive intensity that left neat stacks of split logs arranged around his cabin like defensive fortifications. He hunted with a precision that bordered on compulsive, tracking deer and rabbits through the mountain forests with skills that had been honed during months of combat patrols through the hills of North Korea. Every morning, he walked the perimeter of his property, checking for signs of intrusion or disturbance. Though he couldn't have explained what he was protecting or what he feared might find him, the routine was everything to Marcus, because routine was the only thing that stood between him and the chaos that lived just beneath the surface of his carefully controlled existence. He woke at dawn, made coffee in a battered aluminum pot, ate whatever he had managed to hunt or the canned goods he purchased during his monthly trips to town, and then began the day's work. The work itself didn't matter: splitting wood, repairing the cabin's many defects, maintaining the old hunting trails that crisscrossed his property. What mattered was that it kept his hands busy and his mind focused on immediate, concrete problems that had clear solutions. He had tried alcohol during his first months back from Korea, but the drinking had made the nightmares worse and had led to episodes of uncontrolled rage that terrified him more than the memories themselves. The isolation was safer, cleaner, more predictable than trying to function around other people who couldn't understand what he had seen and done. Marcus had been a sergeant in the 2nd Infantry Division, responsible for a squad of 19-year-old soldiers who looked to him for leadership and protection during some of the most brutal fighting of the entire war. The Heartbreak Ridge campaign had lasted for weeks, with American forces repeatedly attacking heavily fortified North Korean positions in terrain that seemed designed to maximize casualties on both sides. He had been good at his job, perhaps too good. His ability to keep his men alive in impossible situations had earned him commendations and the respect of his superior officers. But it had also placed an enormous burden on his shoulders that grew heavier with each successful mission. Every soldier who made it home because of Marcus's decisions was balanced against the knowledge that other men in other units had not been so fortunate. The breaking point had come during the final weeks of the campaign, when Marcus's squad had been ordered to hold a strategic hill against a massive Chinese assault. For 3 days, they had fought off wave after wave of attacks, with Marcus coordinating the defense while calling in artillery strikes that came dangerously close to their own positions. When the relief force finally reached them, Marcus's squad had successfully held their ground, but the cost had been devastating. Of the 12 men under his command, only 4 had survived uninjured. The others were either dead or so badly wounded that their military service was over. Marcus himself had taken shrapnel in his leg and a concussion from a mortar blast that left him with persistent headaches and a tendency toward sudden, explosive anger. But the physical wounds were nothing compared to the psychological toll of watching young men boys really die under his command. The faces of the soldiers he had failed to protect haunted his dreams, and their voices echoed in his head during the quiet moments when his defenses were down. He could remember every detail of their deaths, every mistake he had made that might have saved them, every decision that had led to their destruction. The Army had offered him counseling, of course, and the opportunity to re-enlist with a promotion and a desk job that would have kept him safely away from combat. Marcus had declined both offers, accepting his discharge and the modest disability pension that came with his Purple Heart and Bronze Star. The medals sat in a box under his bed, never displayed, never acknowledged, symbols of a military service. That felt more like failure than achievement. His family had tried to help during the first months after his return. Marcus's parents lived in a small town in Ohio, where his father worked in a steel mill and his mother taught elementary school. They had welcomed him home with a mixture of pride and concern, organizing elaborate meals and inviting relatives and family friends to celebrate his safe return from the war. But Marcus had found it impossible to participate in these gatherings, unable to bridge the gap between the experiences that had shaped him overseas and the normal domestic concerns that occupied the people around him. Conversations about work schedules and community gossip felt surreal after months of life and death. Decisions made under fire. The laughter and casual interaction that came naturally to everyone else required an effort that exhausted him. His younger brother, Tommy, had been particularly persistent in trying to reconnect, organizing fishing trips and inviting Marcus to join him for drinks with old high school friends who were eager to hear war stories. But Marcus found that he couldn't talk about Korea, couldn't explain what combat had been like, couldn't share the experiences that had defined him for the past 2 years of his life. The silence that developed between Marcus and his family was not hostile, but it was profound and unbridgeable. They loved him and wanted to help, but they couldn't understand why the confident, outgoing young man who had left for the Army had returned as someone withdrawn and haunted. Marcus could see the confusion and hurt in their eyes when he declined invitations or cut conversations short, but he was powerless to explain or to change. The decision to leave Ohio had been inevitable, though Marcus couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when he realized that staying was impossible. He had simply woken up one morning, packed his few belongings into a duffel bag, and driven west without any clear destination in mind. The roads had led him through Pennsylvania and into the mountains of West Virginia, where he had discovered Pine Ridge and the abandoned cabin that would become his refuge. The town below his mountain retreat was typical of Appalachian communities. In the 1950s, built around a combination of coal mining, logging, and subsistence farming that had sustained families for generations. Pine Ridge had about 800 residents, most of whom could trace their ancestry back to the original Scots-Irish settlers who had carved homesteads out of the wilderness in the late 18th century. It was a community that valued self-reliance and minded its own business, which made it an ideal place for someone who wanted to disappear. The locals were curious about the strange veteran who had taken up residence on Copper Mountain, but they were also respectful of his obvious desire for privacy. Marcus's monthly trips to the general store for supplies were conducted with minimal conversation, and the townspeople had learned not to ask questions about his background or his plans. The store's owner, an elderly man named William Preston, had served in the Pacific during World War II and recognized something familiar in Marcus's bearing and behavior. Preston made a point of having Marcus's supplies ready when he arrived, conducted business efficiently and without unnecessary chatter, and occasionally included small extras, a newspaper, a can of coffee, a bottle of aspirin without comment or expectation of payment. It was through these brief interactions with Preston that Marcus learned about the Hartwell family, though the information came in fragments spread across multiple visits. James Hartwell was a veteran himself, having served in Europe during the final years of World War II before returning to Pine Ridge to take over his father's small farm. He had married his high school sweetheart, Dorothy, and together they had built a life centered around their 5 daughters and the challenges of making a living from the rocky soil of the West Virginia mountains. Marcus had never met the Hartwells directly, but he had occasionally seen them during his trips to town. A tall, serious man with prematurely gray hair and a small, energetic woman herding a collection of girls who ranged from toddler to teenager. The family had a reputation for kindness and community involvement, with Dorothy Hartwell organizing church socials and James serving on the volunteer fire department that provided emergency services to the scattered homesteads in the surrounding hills. What Marcus couldn't have known during those casual observations was that the Hartwell family was struggling with problems that went far beyond the usual challenges of rural life. James had been experiencing persistent health issues that made the physical demands of farming increasingly difficult, while Dorothy worked extra hours as a seamstress to supplement their income. The medical bills from James's condition were mounting, and the family was facing the possibility of losing their farm to creditors who had been patient but were running out of options. The oldest Hartwell daughter, 14-year-old Elizabeth, had taken on responsibilities that would have been overwhelming for many adults, helping to care for her younger sisters while managing household tasks that her parents' schedule didn't allow them to handle. 12-year-old Margaret was quiet and studious, often reading to the younger girls and helping them with school lessons when Elizabeth was busy with other responsibilities. 9-year-old Sarah was the family artist, constantly drawing pictures and making up elaborate stories that entertained her sisters during the long winter evenings when outdoor activities were impossible. 6-year-old Catherine was the most outgoing of the sisters, quick to make friends and always ready with a smile that could charm even the most serious adults. 4-year-old Ruth was the baby of the family, still dependent on her sisters for many of her needs but beginning to assert her own personality through a combination of curiosity and stubborn determination. The Hartwell sisters had created their own complex social world within the larger framework of their family, with alliances and rivalries that shifted depending on circumstances but that were always bounded by a fierce loyalty to each other. They shared bedrooms, clothes, toys, and secrets with the easy intimacy that comes from growing up in close quarters. And they had developed a collective identity that was stronger than their individual personalities. None of this was known to Marcus, of course, who observed the family only from a distance and had no reason to think about their internal dynamics or their personal challenges. His focus was entirely on maintaining his own isolated existence and managing the psychological wounds that made normal social interaction feel impossible. But on the night of February 15th, 1953, when an overheated chimney sparked the fire that would destroy the Hartwell farmhouse and kill both parents, the carefully maintained boundaries between Marcus's hermit existence and the community below began to break down in ways that would transform both his life and the lives of 5 little girls who would need a hero more than they had ever needed anything else in their young lives. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The first sign that something was wrong came at 11:47 p.m., when Marcus jerked awake to the sound of distant sirens cutting through the mountain silence. In his disoriented state between sleep and consciousness, the wailing reminded him of air raid warnings in Seoul, and for several terrifying seconds, he was back in Korea, reaching for his rifle and scanning the darkness for enemy movement. But as his mind cleared, Marcus recognized the sound for what it was: the volunteer fire department's ancient truck struggling up the winding road toward the Hartwell farm. From his cabin window, he could see an orange glow painting the underside of the low-hanging clouds, too bright and too sustained to be anything other than a major structure fire. Marcus had no particular affection for his neighbors, but years of military training had ingrained certain responses that were impossible to ignore. When people were in danger, you helped, regardless of personal feelings or convenience. He pulled on his boots and heavy coat, grabbed a flashlight, and began the steep descent down the mountain toward Pine Ridge. The scene that greeted him at the Hartwell farm was chaos barely contained by the desperate efforts of the volunteer firefighters. The 2-story farmhouse was completely engulfed, flames shooting through the roof and windows with an intensity that made approaching the structure suicidal. James Hartwell's truck sat in the driveway, its paint beginning to blister from the heat, while neighbors and firefighters formed the bucket brigade. That was clearly inadequate against the scale of the disaster. Chief Robert Wilson, a grizzled man in his 60s who had been fighting fires in the Pine Ridge area for over 30 years, was shouting orders that no one seemed able to hear over the roar of the flames. The department's single fire truck was pumping water from a nearby creek, but the pressure was weak and the hoses barely reached the burning structure. "Has anyone seen the family?" Wilson was yelling to the crowd of onlookers who had gathered despite the late hour. James? Dorothy? The girls? The question sent a chill through Marcus that had nothing to do with the February cold. He pushed through the crowd of neighbors, many of whom he recognized from his trips to town but had never spoken to directly. "Chief Wilson," Marcus called out, his voice carrying the authority he had learned to project during combat situations. "What's the situation with the family?" Wilson turned toward him, squinting in the firelight. "Sullivan, right? From up on Copper Mountain?" When Marcus nodded, the fire chief continued grimly, "We can't find them. Neighbors saw the fire from the road and called it in, but no one's seen any of the Hartwells. Could be they got out and went. For help, could be." He didn't finish the sentence. Marcus studied the burning building with a tactical eye he had developed during urban combat in Korea. The fire had clearly started in the lower level and spread upward, which meant that anyone trapped inside would have had some warning before the upper floors became uninhabitable. The question was whether they had been able to escape or if they had been overcome by smoke before they could reach safety. "The root cellar," said a voice behind him. Marcus turned to see Harold Mitchell, who owned the adjacent farm. James always kept supplies in the root cellar. If the family had any warning, that's where they would have gone. The root cellar was a stone-lined chamber built into the hillside about 50 yards from the main house, designed to keep food supplies cool during the summer months. It was an old-fashioned construction, typical of Appalachian farms, with thick walls and a heavy wooden door that could potentially provide protection from fire and smoke. Marcus found himself moving toward the cellar before he had consciously decided to do so, his military training taking over as he assessed the tactical situation. The cellar entrance was partially obscured by smoke, but it was far enough from the main fire that approaching it was possible. "Sullivan, wait!" Chief Wilson called after him. "We don't know if the structure is stable." But Marcus was already at the cellar door, his flashlight beam cutting through the smoke as he examined the heavy wooden barrier. The door was closed but not locked, and when he pressed his ear against it, he could hear something that made his heart race, the faint sound of voices, barely audible over the roar of the nearby fire. "There's someone inside!" Marcus shouted back to the firefighters. "I need help getting this door open." The cellar door was warped and swollen from the heat and humidity, requiring the combined efforts of Marcus and 2 volunteer firefighters to force it open. When it finally gave way, a rush of cool air emerged from the underground chamber, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of children crying. Marcus's flashlight beam revealed a sight that would be burned into his memory for the rest of his life. 5 little girls were huddled together in the far corner of the cellar, the oldest Elizabeth holding the youngest in her lap while the others pressed close around her. Their faces were streaked with tears and soot, their nightgowns torn and dirty, but they were alive. "It's okay," Marcus called out, his voice gentler than it had been in months. "We're here to help. You're safe now." Elizabeth looked up at him with eyes that seemed far too old for her 14 years. "Our mama and daddy," she said in a voice barely above a whisper. "They told us to come down here. They were right behind us, but then—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach as he understood what had happened. James and Dorothy Hartwell had saved their children by getting them to safety, but they hadn't made it out themselves. The parents were gone, leaving 5 orphaned girls who would need more help than the Pine Ridge community was equipped to provide. "Come on," Marcus said, extending his hand toward Elizabeth. "Let's get you all out of here and somewhere warm." The evacuation of the cellar took several minutes, with each girl needing individual assistance to climb out of the underground chamber. Marcus found himself automatically taking charge of the operation, his military experience providing the organizational skills needed to move the children safely away from the fire scene. 4-year-old Ruth was the most traumatized, clinging to Elizabeth with desperate strength and refusing to let go even when Marcus tried to carry her. 6-year-old Catherine was in shock, staring at the burning house with wide, uncomprehending eyes. 9-year-old Sarah kept asking for her parents in a voice that grew more panicked with each repetition of the question that no one wanted to answer. It was 12-year-old Margaret who provided the heartbreaking details of what had happened inside the house. "Daddy woke us up," she told Chief Wilson as the firefighters wrapped the girls in blankets. "He said there was a fire and we had to get to the cellar right away. Mama was helping Ruth get dressed and Daddy was checking the windows. They said they would be right behind us." Margaret's voice broke as she continued. "We waited and waited, but they didn't come. Elizabeth said we had to stay in the cellar no matter what, that Mama and Daddy would find us when it was safe. We could hear things falling down up there." The confirmation of their parents' fate spread through the crowd of neighbors with the weight of shared tragedy. James and Dorothy Hartwell had been pillars of the Pine Ridge community, the kind of people everyone relied on during difficult times. Their loss would be felt far beyond their immediate family, but the immediate problem was what to do with 5 orphaned girls who had nowhere to go, and no immediate family members capable of taking them in. Dorothy had a sister in Pennsylvania, but she was elderly and in poor health. James's brother lived in California and hadn't been in contact with the family for years. The closest relatives were distant cousins who barely knew the children and had their own families to support. Dr. Michael Anderson, the town's only physician, arrived at the scene just as the firefighters were loading the girls into his car for transport to his office for medical evaluation. Anderson was a kind man in his 50s who had delivered 4 of the 5 Hartwell girls and had been their family doctor since birth. "They're going to need more than medical attention," Anderson told Marcus quietly as they watched the children being settled into the back seat. "This community doesn't have the resources to handle something like this. The state will probably have to step in, split the girls up among different foster families or institutions." The thought of the sisters being separated hit Marcus with unexpected force. He had observed their obvious closeness during the evacuation, the way they automatically looked to Elizabeth for guidance and comfort, the protective instincts they showed toward each other. Breaking up that family unit seemed like adding cruelty to an already devastating tragedy. "There has to be another option," Marcus said, surprising himself with the intensity of his reaction. "These girls have been through enough without being torn away from each other." Dr. Anderson looked at him with curiosity. "You sound like you have something in mind, Sullivan. Are you thinking about getting involved?" The question caught Marcus off guard because he hadn't been consciously thinking anything of the sort. His life was built around isolation and avoiding exactly these kinds of human complications. 5 orphaned girls represented the opposite of everything he had been seeking on Copper Mountain. But as he watched Elizabeth Hartwell comfort her younger sisters while dealing with her own grief and trauma, Marcus found himself thinking about the men he had failed to protect in Korea. Here was a situation where his help might actually make a difference, where his skills and resources might prevent a tragedy from becoming something even worse. "I don't know," Marcus admitted, "but there has to be something better than splitting them up." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff David Coleman, whose presence signaled the beginning of the official investigation into the fire and the formal process of determining what would happen to the orphaned children. Coleman was a fair man, but he was also a pragmatist who understood the limitations of rural social services in 1953. "Marcus," the sheriff said, acknowledging him with a nod. "Didn't expect to see you down here tonight." "Just trying to help," Marcus replied, which was true as far as it went, though it didn't explain the growing sense of responsibility he felt toward the 5 girls who were now completely alone in the world. Sheriff Coleman interviewed the neighbors who had first spotted the fire, documenting the timeline of events and gathering information that would be needed for the insurance investigation and the coroner's inquiry. The cause of the fire appeared to be a defective chimney that had overheated and ignited the wooden structure of the house, a common enough occurrence in rural areas where heating systems were often jury-rigged and poorly maintained. As dawn broke over the smoldering ruins of the Hartwell farm, the immediate crisis was over, but the larger problem was just beginning. 5 little girls who had lost everything would need food, shelter, clothing, and most importantly, the kind of emotional support that could help them process the trauma they had experienced. The Pine Ridge community would do what it could. Of course, churches would organize clothing drives, neighbors would provide meals, and families would offer temporary housing. But everyone understood that these were stopgap measures, temporary solutions to a problem that required permanent answers. Marcus found himself walking back up Copper Mountain as the sun rose, his mind churning with thoughts and emotions he hadn't experienced in months. The isolation that had seemed so essential to his survival suddenly felt selfish and inadequate in the face of genuine human need. Behind him, the community of Pine Ridge was beginning to mobilize its resources to help the Hartwell sisters. But Marcus could already see the limitations of what local charity could accomplish. These girls needed more than temporary assistance. They needed a family, a home, and the kind of stability that would allow them to heal from their trauma and build new lives. The question that would haunt Marcus for the days to come was whether he had anything to offer 5 orphaned girls who deserved so much more than a broken soldier could possibly provide. 3 days after the fire, Pine Ridge faced a crisis that went far beyond the immediate tragedy of the Hartwell family's loss. The 5 sisters had been staying at Dr. Anderson's house, sleeping in his daughter's old room and eating meals prepared by his wife, but everyone understood this was a temporary arrangement that couldn't continue indefinitely. The Anderson home had become an unofficial headquarters for the community's response to the orphan crisis. Church ladies arrived throughout the day with casseroles and hand-sewn clothing, while men from the volunteer fire department organized work crews to salvage anything useful from the burned farmhouse ruins. But beneath the surface of organized charity, difficult conversations were taking place about what would happen when the immediate emergency response ended. Marcus had returned to his mountain cabin after the fire, but he found it impossible to settle back into his previous routine. The image of Elizabeth Hartwell protecting her younger sisters in that dark cellar haunted him in ways that were different from his war memories. This wasn't about failure or loss, it was about potential, about 5 lives that could still be saved if someone was willing to take responsibility. On the 3rd morning, Marcus made a decision that surprised even himself. He cleaned up as much as his limited facilities allowed, put on his least-worn shirt, and walked down to Pine Ridge to visit the Anderson house. He told himself he was just checking on the girls' welfare, but the truth was more complicated than that. Mary Anderson answered the door with flour on her apron and exhaustion in her eyes. She was a kind woman in her late 40s who had raised 3 children of her own, but managing 5 traumatized orphans was testing her patience and resources in ways she hadn't anticipated. "Mr. Sullivan," she said with genuine warmth, "how thoughtful of you to come check on the girls. Please come in." The Anderson house was chaos in the way that only homes with multiple children can achieve. Ruth was sitting on the kitchen floor, crying because her oatmeal was too hot while 4-year-old Logic made it impossible to understand that waiting would solve the problem. Catherine was asking endless questions about where her parents had gone, questions that Mary Anderson was struggling to answer in age-appropriate ways. Sarah had found paper and crayons and was drawing picture after picture of houses on fire. Her artistic talent turned toward processing trauma in the only way she knew how. Margaret sat quietly in a corner with a book, but Marcus could see that she wasn't actually reading. Her eyes tracked across the same page without turning it. Lost in thoughts too complex for her 12 years, that it was Elizabeth who drew Marcus's attention most powerfully. The 14-year-old had positioned herself where she could monitor all her sisters simultaneously, ready to intervene if any of them needed comfort or guidance. She was trying to fulfill the parental role that had suddenly fallen to her, but the weight of that responsibility was clearly overwhelming. "Elizabeth," Mary Anderson called gently. "This is Mr. Sullivan. He's the one who helped get you out of the cellar." Elizabeth looked up at Marcus with those prematurely aged eyes, studying his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "Thank you," she said formally, "for helping us." "How are you all doing?" Marcus asked, though the answer was obvious from the barely controlled chaos around him. "We're managing," Elizabeth replied, which was clearly more hope than reality. "Mrs. Anderson has been very kind." Mary Anderson drew Marcus aside while the girls were occupied with breakfast. "I need to be honest with you, Mr. Sullivan. This isn't working. Not because I don't want to help, but because we simply don't have the space or resources for 5 additional children. My husband is being patient, but his practice is suffering because our house has turned into a temporary orphanage. The stress in her voice was evident, and Marcus could see the toll that 3 days of crisis management had taken on the Anderson family. They were good people trying to do the right thing, but they were reaching the limits of what temporary charity could accomplish. "What are the options?" Marcus asked, though he dreaded the answer. "The county social worker is coming tomorrow," Mary explained. "Mrs. Helen Crawford from the State Department. She'll evaluate the situation and make recommendations about permanent placement for the girls." Marcus had never met Mrs. Crawford, but he could imagine what those recommendations would involve. State institutions, foster families scattered across different counties, the systematic dismantling of the family unit that the Hartwell sisters represented. It was the logical solution from a bureaucratic perspective, but it ignored the emotional bonds that held the girls together. "Is there no family who could take them?" Marcus asked. Mary shook her head. "Dorothy's sister in Pennsylvania is 73 and has arthritis so bad she can barely care for herself. James's brother in California hasn't responded to our telegrams, and even if he did, he has 4 children of his own and barely makes ends meet. There are some distant cousins in Virginia, but they've made it clear they could maybe take 1 child, not 5. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the kitchen, where Ruth had knocked over her milk glass and was now crying loudly enough to wake the entire neighborhood. Elizabeth immediately moved to clean up the mess, while Catherine tried to comfort her younger sister, demonstrating once again the family dynamics that would be destroyed if the girls were separated. Marcus found himself watching this domestic scene with growing emotional investment. These weren't abstract charity cases. They were 5 individual people with distinct personalities and needs, bound together by love and shared experience. Breaking them apart seemed like a kind of violence that would compound the trauma they had already endured. "I should probably go," Marcus said, though he made no move toward the door. "I just wanted to make sure they were all right." "Actually," Mary Anderson said, lowering her voice further, "I'm glad you came by. There's something I wanted to discuss with you." She led him into the front parlor, away from the kitchen chaos, and closed the door behind them. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of careful consideration. "The girls have been asking about you," she said, "Elizabeth especially. She keeps talking about the man who found them in the cellar, who helped them get out. I think you made quite an impression." Marcus felt uncomfortable with the idea that he had somehow become important to the children. "I just did what anyone would have done." "No," Mary said firmly. "You did what needed to be done, when it needed to be done. That's different than what most people would have managed." She paused, studying his face carefully before continuing. "My husband and I have been talking about this situation, trying to think of alternatives to state placement. We know these girls need more than the system can provide, and we know the community cares about keeping them together. But that requires someone with the resources and commitment to take on 5 children." Marcus could see where this conversation was heading, and it terrified him more than enemy artillery had in Korea. "Mrs. Anderson, I appreciate what you're suggesting, but I'm not the right person for something like that. I live alone for good reasons. I'm not suitable for raising children." "Why not?" Mary asked bluntly. "You have a home, you have income from your military pension, and you clearly care about what happens to these girls. What makes you think you're not suitable?" The question forced Marcus to confront assumptions about himself that he had been carrying for months. He thought about the nightmares, the sudden rages, the carefully maintained isolation that kept him functional. How could he explain to this kind woman that he was too damaged to be trusted with children's welfare? "I have problems," he said finally, "from the war, things that make me unpredictable sometimes." Mary Anderson nodded as if she had expected this response. "My brother came back from the Pacific with similar problems. Nightmares, drinking, anger he couldn't control. You know what helped him?" having something more important than his own pain to focus on, having people who needed him to be better than his worst impulses. The suggestion that responsibility might be therapeutic rather than burdensome was a perspective Marcus had never considered. In his experience, caring about other people had led only to loss and guilt when he failed to protect them. But Mary Anderson was suggesting that the opposite might be true, that caring for the Hartwell sisters might help him heal as much as it helped them. Before he could respond, the parlor door burst open and Ruth came running in, tears streaming down her face. "Elizabeth says Mama and Daddy aren't coming back," she sobbed, throwing herself against Marcus's leg with the instinctive trust that only 4-year-olds possess. "But I want them to come back." Marcus found himself kneeling down to Ruth's level without conscious thought, his large hands awkward but gentle as he tried to comfort her. "I know you do, sweetheart. I know you want them back. Will you help us find them?" Ruth asked with heartbreaking hope. "Elizabeth says you're good at finding people." The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond a child's misunderstanding of death. Ruth was asking for help, but she was also offering trust, the kind of absolute faith that children place in adults who have proven themselves capable of protection and comfort. "I'll help you however I can," Marcus heard himself saying, though he wasn't sure what that commitment might ultimately require. Elizabeth appeared in the doorway, having followed her youngest sister. "Ruth, you shouldn't bother Mr. Sullivan. He has his own things to worry about." The protective instinct in Elizabeth's voice reminded Marcus of himself during his squad leader days. The assumption that everyone else's needs came before your own, that responsibility meant carrying burdens that might be too heavy to manage. It was a dangerous way for a 14-year-old to think, but it was probably the only thing that had kept her sisters functioning since the fire. "You're not bothering me," Marcus told Ruth, but his eyes were on Elizabeth. "Sometimes it helps to talk about difficult things." Mary Anderson watched this interaction with the calculating gaze of someone who had spent decades reading human behavior. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of a woman who had made up her mind about something important. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, "I think you should stay for lunch. The girls could use the company, and I suspect you could too." It wasn't really a suggestion, and Marcus found himself agreeing before he had time to think through the implications. Lunch stretched into the afternoon as he found himself drawn into conversations with each of the sisters, learning about their personalities and interests in ways that made them increasingly real to him as individuals, rather than abstract victims of tragedy. Margaret showed him her collection of books, explaining the stories with an intelligence that impressed him. Sarah shared her drawings, including several that depicted a tall man helping children escape from a dark place. Catherine asked him endless questions about his cabin on the mountain, fascinated by the idea of living in the woods like a character from a fairy tale. Elizabeth remained reserved but watchful, clearly evaluating whether this strange man might represent safety or danger for her family. Her protective instincts were admirable, but Marcus could see the exhaustion behind her composed facade. She was trying to be strong for everyone else while dealing with her own grief and trauma. As the day wore on, Marcus realized that something fundamental was changing in his relationship with the Pine Ridge community and with himself. For months, he had defined himself primarily by his limitations, the things he couldn't do, the ways he was broken, the reasons he needed to remain isolated. But spending time with the Hartwell sisters was forcing him to consider a different perspective. What if the question wasn't whether he was too damaged to help them, but whether they might need exactly the kind of help that someone with his particular experiences could provide? What if his understanding of trauma and loss made him uniquely qualified to guide them through their own healing process? By evening, when Mrs. Crawford would arrive the next day to evaluate the girl's situation, Marcus had made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. He was going to ask to be considered as a permanent guardian for all 5 Hartwell sisters. It was a terrifying prospect that went against every instinct he had developed about avoiding responsibility and human connection. But as he walked back up Copper Mountain that night, Marcus carried with him something he hadn't felt since Korea, a sense of purpose that extended beyond his own survival and healing. Mrs. Helen Crawford arrived in Pine Ridge precisely at 9 o'clock on Thursday morning, driving a state-issued sedan that looked out of place among the pickup trucks and farming equipment that typically lined Main Street. She was a woman in her early 50s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and the brisk, no-nonsense manner of someone who had dealt with too many tragic situations to waste time on sentiment. Marcus watched her arrival from the window of Preston's general store, where he had been nursing a cup of coffee for the past hour while working up the courage to implement the decision he had made the night before. His plan, if it could be called, that was to intercept Mrs. Crawford before she met with the girls and present himself as a potential guardian. It was audacious to the point of absurdity, but Marcus had learned in Korea that sometimes the most unlikely strategies were the only ones with any chance of success. "That's her," William Preston said, joining Marcus at the window. The store owner had been briefing him on Mrs. Crawford's reputation, which was formidable. She had been with the state social services department for over 20 years and was known for making decisions based on regulations and practical considerations rather than emotional appeals. "She's fair," Preston continued, "but she's got quotas to meet and limited resources to work with. Word is that the state institutions are overcrowded, which means she'll be looking to place the girls in separate foster homes as quickly as possible." Marcus nodded, though his stomach was churning with nervousness. He had faced enemy machine, done nests with less anxiety, and he felt about the conversation he was about to initiate. "What do you think my chances are?" Preston studied him with the evaluating gaze of a man who had been reading people's character for decades. "Honestly, not good. You're a single man with no experience raising children, living in an isolated cabin with barely adequate facilities. On paper, you're exactly the kind of placement she's trained to avoid." But Marcus sensed there was more to Preston's assessment. "But she's also practical enough to know that keeping 5 sisters together is better than splitting them up, assuming she can find someone capable of handling the responsibility. And anyone who knows this community knows that you're not the hermit people think you are. You've been quietly helping folks for months, fixing Mrs. Patterson's roof last fall, clearing snow from the church parking lot, making sure old Tom Bradley had enough firewood for the winter." Marcus was startled by this catalog of activities he had assumed were unnoticed. His helping neighbors had been instinctive rather than calculated, small acts that kept his hands busy and his mind occupied during the difficult transition to civilian life. "People notice more than you think," Preston said with a slight smile. "The question is whether Mrs. Crawford will be willing to look beyond the regulations to see what this community already knows about your character." Across the street, Mrs. Crawford was emerging from her sedan with a leather briefcase and the determined stride of someone with a schedule to keep. Marcus took a deep breath, paid for his coffee, and walked out to meet her before she could reach the Anderson house. "Mrs. Crawford," he called out, falling into step beside her. "I'm Marcus Sullivan. I was hoping I could speak with you about the Hartwell sisters before you meet with them." She paused, studying him with sharp blue eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of his appearance and demeanor. "Mr. Sullivan, you're the one who found them in the cellar, correct?" "Yes, ma'am. I'd like to discuss the possibility of serving as their guardian." Mrs. Crawford's eyebrows rose slightly, but her expression remained professionally neutral. "I see. That's quite a responsibility, Mr. Sullivan. 5 children, ages 4 to 14. Are you married?" "No, ma'am." "Do you have experience caring for children?" "Not directly, but I had responsibility for young soldiers in Korea. Some of them weren't much older than Elizabeth." It was a weak comparison, and they both knew it, but Mrs. Crawford made a note in her pad without comment. "I understand you live alone on the mountain. What kind of facilities do you have for housing 5 children? Marcus had anticipated this question, though his answer wouldn't sound impressive. The cabin is small, but it's structurally sound. There's electricity from a generator, running water from a well, and adequate heating. It would need modifications, but the space could be expanded. What about income? Raising 5 children is expensive, Mr. Sullivan. Food, clothing, medical care, education, the costs add up quickly. I receive a military pension and disability compensation. It's not a fortune, but it's steady income. And I have savings from my time in service. Marcus had calculated his finances carefully the night before, determining that he could support the girls if he was careful with expenses. Mrs. Crawford continued taking notes, but Marcus could see skepticism in her expression. Mr. Sullivan, I appreciate your intentions, but you must understand that the state has very specific requirements for child placement. We need to ensure that children are placed in stable environments with proven caregivers. A single man with no child-rearing experience, living in isolation... She let the sentence trail off diplomatically. I understand your concerns, Marcus said, choosing his words carefully, but I'd like you to consider something else. These girls have been through trauma that most people can't understand. They've lost everything, their parents, their home, their sense of security. What they need isn't just someone who meets bureaucratic requirements. They need someone who understands what it means to rebuild your life after everything falls apart. The comparison to his own experience wasn't subtle, but it was honest. Mrs. Crawford seemed to consider this perspective, though her expression remained guarded. That's an interesting point, she said finally. But understanding trauma and being capable of providing proper care are different things. These children need stability, education, proper nutrition, medical attention, and emotional support. Can you honestly say you're prepared to provide all of that? Marcus thought about the nightmares that still disrupted his sleep, the episodes of anger that could emerge without warning, the carefully maintained routines that kept his psychological wounds from overwhelming him. Could someone like him really provide the stability that traumatized children needed? But then he thought about Elizabeth trying to carry responsibilities that were too heavy for her shoulders, about Ruth crying for parents who would never return, about 5 sisters who faced separation simply because the system couldn't accommodate their need to stay together. I can't promise I'll be perfect, Marcus said honestly, but I can promise I'll do everything in my power to give them what they need. And I can promise that I'll never give up on them, no matter how difficult things get. Mrs. Crawford studied his face for a long moment, seeming to weigh his sincerity against her professional caution. I'll need to inspect your living situation, of course. And there would be a probationary period with regular check-ins. The state doesn't take chances with children's welfare. The fact that she was even considering his proposal felt like a victory, though Marcus knew the real challenges lay ahead. Of course, whatever you need to verify. There's something else, Mrs. Crawford said, lowering her voice slightly. I've been doing this work for 20 years, and I've seen what happens when siblings are separated. The emotional damage can last for decades. If there's a way to keep these girls together that meets state requirements, I'm willing to explore it. Relief flooded through Marcus, though he tried not to show it. Thank you for considering it. Don't thank me yet, Mrs. Crawford warned. I still need to meet with the children, assess their emotional state, and determine what they need. Your proposal is just one option among several. They had reached the Anderson house, where the sound of children's voices could be heard through the open windows. Mrs. Crawford paused at the front gate, gathering herself for what would undoubtedly be a difficult interview. Mr. Sullivan, she sighed, assuming your living situation meets basic requirements, there's one more thing I need to know. These children have been through tremendous trauma. They're going to need patience, understanding, and probably professional help to recover. Are you prepared for the possibility that healing might take years? That there might be setbacks and behavioral problems along the way? Marcus thought about his own healing process, how slowly and imperfectly he had been learning to manage his war trauma. Yes, ma'am. I understand that healing doesn't happen quickly or easily. Mrs. Crawford nodded, seeming satisfied with his answer. Then let's see how the children respond to the idea. The interview with the Hartwell sisters took place in the Anderson family's living room, with Mary Anderson present to provide emotional support. Mrs. Crawford had a gentle manner with children that contrasted with her earlier, professional brusqueness. But the questions she asked were probing and direct. She spoke with each girl individually, assessing their emotional state and their understanding of their situation. Ruth was too young to fully comprehend what was happening, but she was clear about wanting to stay with her sisters. Catherine expressed worry about being good enough for whatever family might take them in, a concern that broke Marcus's heart. Sarah had prepared a drawing specifically for the meeting at Tia. Picture of 5 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow with "together" written in careful block letters across the bottom. Margaret answered questions with the thoughtful precision of someone older than her years, demonstrating the intellectual maturity that would serve her well regardless of where she ended up. It was Elizabeth who proved most challenging to interview. The 14-year-old had clearly appointed herself as protector and spokesperson for her sisters, a role that made her suspicious of any adult who might threaten their family unit. "We don't need to be split up," Elizabeth said firmly when Mrs. Crawford explained the typical placement process. "I can take care of my sisters. I've been doing it since the fire." "Elizabeth," Mrs. Crawford said gently, "you've done an amazing job looking after your family. But you're 14 years old. You deserve to have adults taking care of you, not the other way around." "But what if the adults don't understand?" Elizabeth asked, her composure cracking slightly. "What if they try to change us or make us forget? Our parents?" The question revealed the depth of Elizabeth's fears about placement with strangers. She wasn't just worried about separation. She was worried about losing the family identity that connected her to her deceased parents and to the life they had all shared before the fire. Mrs. Crawford spent nearly an hour with Elizabeth alone, gradually drawing out her concerns and fears. When she finally asked about the possibility of Mr. Sullivan serving as their guardian, Elizabeth's response was immediate and decisive. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "He helped us when we needed help. He didn't try to split us up or make decisions for us. He just helped." The endorsement from Elizabeth carried enormous weight with her younger sisters, who had come to rely on her judgment in all matters affecting their welfare. When Mrs. Crawford asked each of them individually about the possibility of living with Marcus, their responses ranged from Ruth's enthusiastic, "Yes, he's nice," to Margaret's more thoughtful, "I think he would try to take good care of us." By afternoon, Mrs. Crawford had completed her initial assessment and was ready to visit Marcus's cabin to evaluate his living situation. The drive up Copper Mountain was treacherous even in daylight, requiring 4-wheel drive and considerable skill to navigate the steep, rutted road. Marcus had spent the morning frantically cleaning and organizing his modest home, trying to present it in the best possible light. But as Mrs. Crawford surveyed the single room that served as kitchen, living area, and bedroom, he could see her calculating how 5 children could possibly fit in such a limited space. "It's obviously too small as it currently stands," Marcus said, anticipating her concerns. "But there's room to expand. I could add bedrooms, improve the bathroom facilities, maybe even add a proper kitchen." Mrs. Crawford was taking notes and measurements, her expression neutral but not discouraging. "The structure seems sound," she observed, "and the location provides privacy, which could be beneficial for children who need time to heal." She spent considerable time examining the generator that provided electricity, the well water system, and the heating arrangements. Everything was functional but basic, the kind of setup that worked for a single man but would require significant upgrades for a family. "Mr. Sullivan," she said finally, "I'm going to be frank with you. This placement would be highly irregular. The state has procedures and regulations for good reasons, and you don't meet most of the standard criteria for child guardianship." Marcus felt his hopes beginning to sink, but Mrs. Crawford wasn't finished. "However," she continued, "I've been in this business long enough to know that sometimes unusual situations require unusual solutions. These children have very specific needs, and they've made their preferences clear. If you're willing to make the necessary improvements to your living situation and submit to regular state supervision, I'm prepared to recommend a trial placement." The relief that flooded through Marcus was so intense it left him momentarily speechless. Mrs. Crawford seemed to understand his reaction, but her expression remained serious. "This won't be easy," she warned. "You'll be essentially starting from scratch learning to be a parent to 5 children simultaneously, each with different needs and personalities. You'll need to provide education, either through the local school system or through approved homeschooling. You'll need to handle medical care, behavioral issues, and the ongoing emotional trauma from their loss." "I understand," Marcus said, though he suspected he only partially comprehended the magnitude of what he was taking on. "There's one more thing," Mrs. Crawford said. "The state will require that you receive training and support in child care and trauma recovery. We can't just place 5 orphaned children with someone and hope for the best." Marcus nodded eagerly. "Whatever training you think is necessary." Mrs. Crawford closed her notebook with a decisive snap. "Then let's go back to town and discuss the practical arrangements. If we're going to do this, we need to do it properly." As they drove back down the mountain, Marcus found himself thinking about the enormous changes that lay ahead. In the space of a few days, he had gone from complete isolation to contemplating the guardianship of 5 children. It was terrifying and overwhelming, but it was also the first time since Korea that he had felt truly necessary to other people's welfare. The broken soldier who had retreated to Copper Mountain to hide from the world was about to become the foundation of a new family, built from the ashes of tragedy and held together by the most unlikely combination of need and determination. The transformation of Marcus Sullivan's mountain cabin began at dawn the day after Mrs. Crawford's conditional approval. What had seemed like an impossible timeline, 2 weeks to make his primitive shelter suitable for 5 children, suddenly became a community project that revealed the true character of Pine Ridge in ways that surprised everyone involved. First to arrive was Harold Mitchell, the neighboring farmer who had suggested checking the root cellar during the fire. He came with his eldest son, Tommy, and a truck loaded with lumber that he claimed was just lying around taking up space. Behind him came 3 members of the volunteer fire department, including Chief Wilson, who had appointed himself unofficial construction foreman for the project. "Figure we owe you something for what you did the night of the fire," Chief Wilson explained as he began sketching expansion plans in the dirt beside Marcus's cabin. "Besides, those girls are going to need a proper home, and we're not about to let bureaucrats split them up because your place wasn't fancy enough." Marcus found himself overwhelmed by the outpouring of support from people he had barely spoken to during his months of isolation. Men who had respected his desire for privacy were now tramping through his cabin, measuring walls and debating the best way to add 2 bedrooms and expand the existing bathroom. Women he recognized from his trips to the general store arrived with cleaning supplies and began scrubbing every surface with a thoroughness that made his previous housekeeping efforts seem pathetic. The construction work revealed skills and resources within the Pine Ridge community that hadn't been evident during normal times. John Patterson, who ran a small sawmill operation, donated enough fresh lumber to frame the new rooms. Sam Brewster, who had learned plumbing during a stint in Charleston before returning to farm his family's land, volunteered to install proper indoor plumbing that would meet state inspection standards. Even more surprising was the participation of people. Marcus had never expected to care about his situation. Mrs. Eugene Potter, the stern widow who managed the Church Ladies' Auxiliary, arrived with fabric samples and precise measurements for curtains and bedding. She had somehow determined the color preferences of each Hartwell sister and was prepared to coordinate a decorating scheme that would make the expanded cabin feel like a real home rather than just enlarged bachelor quarters. Children need beauty in their lives. Mrs. Potter informed Marcus with the authority of someone who had raised 6 children and buried a husband. Especially children who have seen too much ugliness already. You'll have enough challenges teaching them to trust the world again without subjecting them to bare walls and mismatched furniture. The work progressed with military-like efficiency that reminded Marcus of construction projects he had supervised in Korea, though the atmosphere was entirely different. Instead of the grim urgency of building defensive positions under enemy threat, this project had the celebratory feeling of a community coming together to solve a problem that affected everyone. Elizabeth Hartwell visited the construction site every afternoon, walking up from the Anderson house to monitor progress and offer input on details that mattered to her sisters. Her presence added an urgency to the work that abstract deadlines couldn't have provided. Every man swinging a hammer could see exactly who would benefit from his efforts. "Ruth will need a night light," Elizabeth told Mrs. Potter as they discussed bedroom arrangements. "She's been afraid of the dark since the fire. And Margaret likes to read, so she need good light by her bed." These practical details forced Marcus to think about aspects of child care that had never occurred to him. He had been focused on meeting Mrs. Crawford's basic requirements for space and safety, but Elizabeth's comments made him realize that creating a home meant understanding each child's individual needs and fears. The expansion project also provided opportunities for Marcus to observe how the sisters interacted with the larger community. Catherine charmed the construction workers by bringing them glasses of water and asking endless questions about their tools and techniques. Sarah sketched pictures of the building process, creating a visual record that captured both the physical changes and the emotional investment of everyone involved. Margaret impressed the adult volunteers with her ability to remember complex measurements and architectural details, often serving as an unofficial assistant to Chief Wilson when he needed to verify dimensions or locate specific materials. Even 4-year-old Ruth contributed by helping to sort nails and screws. Though her assistance was more symbolic than practical. It was during these afternoon visits that Marcus began to understand the individual personalities of his future charges in ways that would prove crucial to their eventual success as a family. Elizabeth was the organizer and protector, but she also carried tremendous anxiety about making decisions that might affect her sister's welfare. Margaret was intellectually curious but emotionally guarded, processing her grief through books and solitary reflection. Catherine was the social connector, naturally drawing adults into conversation and making them feel appreciated for their efforts. Sarah expressed herself through art, using her drawings to communicate feelings that were too complex for words. Ruth, despite her young age, was remarkably resilient, bouncing back from moments of sadness with the adaptability that often characterizes 4-year-olds. The construction project also gave Marcus his first real experience of functioning as part of a community rather than as an isolated individual. For months, he had defined himself primarily by his problems and limitations, seeing his relationships with others as potential sources of disappointment or betrayal. But working alongside neighbors who were investing their time and resources in his success began to shift his perspective. "You know," Chief Wilson said one evening as they reviewed the day's progress, "I wasn't sure about this plan when Mrs. Crawford first mentioned it. Single man taking on 5 kids seemed like asking for trouble. But watching you work with the girls, seeing how seriously you're taking this responsibility, I think you might just pull it off." The endorsement meant more to Marcus than he could express, coming from a man whose judgment was respected throughout the community. But it also increased the pressure he felt to succeed, to prove worthy of the investment that so many people were making in his unlikely guardianship. The most challenging aspect of the construction period was managing his own psychological responses to the sudden change in his living situation. For months, Marcus had carefully controlled his environment to minimize triggers that might set off episodes of anxiety or anger. The constant presence of other people, the noise of construction, the disruption of his established routines, all of it challenged the coping mechanisms he had developed since returning from Korea. There were moments when the chaos became overwhelming. When Marcus found himself retreating to the woods around his cabin just to escape the well-meaning invasion of his privacy. During these episodes, he questioned whether he was really capable of handling much greater disruption that 5 children would bring to his life. It was during one of these retreats that Dr. Anderson found him, sitting on a fallen log about a quarter-mile from the construction site. The physician had been making regular visits to check on the progress and ensure that the modifications would meet health and safety requirements for child placement. Having second thoughts? Dr. Anderson asked, settling beside Marcus on the log. Maybe, Marcus admitted. I spent months getting used to the quiet, learning to manage ... my problems. Now there are people everywhere, noise, chaos. If I can't handle construction workers, how am I going to handle 5 children? Dr. Anderson considered this concern seriously before responding. You know, I've been thinking about that myself. About whether someone with your experiences should be taking on this kind of responsibility. Marcus felt his heart sink, wondering if the community's support was beginning to waver. But then I watch you with those girls, Dr. Anderson continued, and I see something I didn't expect. You're not trying to fix them or change them. You're just as ... present, available. That's rarer than you might think, especially with traumatized children. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Most people, when they encounter children who have been through trauma, they want to rush in and make everything better immediately. They push too hard, try too fast, and end up making things worse. But you seem to understand that healing takes time. The observation surprised Marcus, who had assumed his cautious approach reflected uncertainty rather than wisdom. I just don't want to make things worse for them. Exactly, Dr. Anderson said. That's the right instinct. These girls don't need someone who has all the answers. They need someone who's willing to figure things out alongside them, someone who understands that setbacks are part of the process. The conversation provided Marcus with a new framework for thinking about his role as guardian. Instead of seeing his own psychological struggles as disqualifications, he began to consider how his experience with trauma and recovery might actually be assets in helping the girls heal from their own losses. As the construction project neared completion, Mrs. Crawford made her second visit to evaluate the modifications and determine whether the expanded cabin met state requirements for child placement. The transformation was dramatic enough to surprise even Marcus, who had been present for every day of the work. What had been a cramped, bachelor-oriented space had become a genuine family home. 2 new bedrooms provided private space for the older girls to share and for the younger ones to have their own room. The expanded bathroom included a proper bathtub and adequate storage for the personal items that 5 children would accumulate. The kitchen had been enlarged and equipped with a proper refrigerator and modern appliances that would make meal preparation manageable for someone learning to cook for 6 people instead of 1. The living area had been reorganized to accommodate study space, play areas, and a kind of comfortable seating that would encourage family interaction. Mrs. Crawford's inspection was thorough and professional, but Marcus could see approval in her expression as she examined each room and tested the various systems. When she interviewed the Hartwell sisters about their feelings regarding the upcoming placement, their enthusiasm was unmistakable. "It's like a real house now," Catherine said, bouncing on one of the new beds. "Big enough for all of us." "I like the bookshelf in our room," Margaret added quietly. "Mr. Sullivan said I could arrange my books however I wanted." Elizabeth's endorsement was more measured but equally significant. "It feels safe," she said simply. "Like a place where we could actually live, not just stay temporarily." The final hurdle was Marcus's completion of the parenting and trauma recovery training that Mrs. Crawford had required. The classes, conducted by a social worker from the county seat, covered topics ranging from child development and educational requirements to recognizing signs of emotional distress and appropriate disciplinary techniques. For Marcus, the most valuable aspect of the training was learning about how children process grief and trauma differently than adults. Understanding that behavioral problems, regression, and emotional outbursts were normal parts of the healing process helped him prepare mentally for challenges that might have otherwise seemed like personal failures. "Children don't heal in straight lines," the instructor explained during one session. "They may seem to be doing well for weeks, then suddenly have a terrible day that brings back all their fears and sadness. Your job isn't to prevent these setbacks, but to provide consistency and support while they work through them." By the end of the 2-week preparation period, Marcus had accumulated not just an expanded and properly equipped home, but also a support network within the Pine Ridge community that he had never expected to possess. The isolation that had once seemed essential to his survival had been replaced by connections that made him stronger rather than more vulnerable. On the evening before the Hartwell sisters were scheduled to move to their new home, Marcus sat on his expanded front porch looking down at the lights of Pine Ridge below. The view was the same as it had been for months, but everything else about his life was about to change in ways that still seemed surreal. Tomorrow, he would become the guardian of 5 orphaned girls, responsible for their physical and emotional welfare, their education, their healing, and their future. It was a terrifying prospect that challenged every assumption he had made about his own limitations and capabilities, but it was also an opportunity to discover whether the broken soldier who had retreated to Copper Mountain might be capable of becoming something more than the sum of his wounds and failures. The community of Pine Ridge had given him the tools and support to succeed. Now he would have to find the courage and wisdom to use them. Moving day arrived with a mixture of excitement and terror that Marcus had never experienced. Not even during his first combat mission in Korea. The Hartwell sisters gathered their few possessions, mostly clothes, donated by the community, and a handful of salvaged items from their burned home, and prepared to begin their new life on Copper Mountain. The reality of becoming an instant father to 5 children hit Marcus the moment their car disappeared down the mountain road, leaving him alone with Elizabeth, Margaret, Catherine, Sarah, and Ruth for the first time. The silence that followed was unlike anything he had experienced during his months of isolation. It was heavy with expectation, uncertainty, and the enormous weight of responsibility. "So," Elizabeth said finally, standing in the middle of the expanded living room with her arms around Ruth, "I guess we should figure out how this is going to work." Her practical tone reminded Marcus of squad leaders he had known in Korea, people who understood that someone had to take charge when situations were uncertain. But Elizabeth was 14 years old, and the burden of leadership she had been carrying was too heavy for her shoulders. "First thing," Marcus said, settling into the chair that had become his unofficial command post, "we need to establish some basic routines. Mealtimes, bedtimes, rules about chores and responsibilities. But I want everyone's input on how we set things up." The democratic approach was intentional, based on advice from his parenting classes about giving traumatized children some control over their environment. But it also reflected Marcus's genuine uncertainty about how families were supposed to function on a day-to-day basis. Margaret raised her hand tentatively, as if she were in school. "What about homework and reading time?" Elizabeth has been helping me with my studies, but I don't want to fall behind. The question highlighted one of Marcus's greatest anxieties about guardianship, his responsibility for the girl's education. The nearest school was a 40-minute drive down treacherous mountain roads, making daily transportation a significant challenge, especially during winter weather. "We'll figure out the school situation," Marcus promised, though he wasn't sure how. "For now, we can continue with home lessons until we get everything organized." Catherine bounced on the new couch, testing its springs with 4-year-old enthusiasm. "Can we have pancakes for breakfast?" Mama used to make pancakes on Sundays, and they were really good. The innocent request hit Marcus like a physical blow, reminding him that everything he did would be measured against memories of parents who could never be replaced. How could he possibly compete with idealized recollections of family traditions that had been destroyed by tragedy? "I don't know how to make pancakes," Marcus admitted honestly. "But maybe Elizabeth could teach me, if she knows how." Elizabeth's face brightened slightly at being asked to contribute rather than simply being taken care of. "Mama taught me last year. I think I remember." Sarah had been quiet during this exchange, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a new box of crayons that Mrs. Potter had provided. But now she looked up with serious blue eyes that seemed too old for her 9 years. "Are you going to get tired of us?" she asked with devastating directness. Mrs. Anderson was nice, but I could tell we were too much work for her family. The question revealed fears that went to the heart of the children's insecurity about their place in the world. They had already lost one family through tragedy. The possibility of losing another through rejection was a constant source of anxiety. Marcus knelt down to Sarah's level, remembering advice from his training about the importance of direct eye contact when addressing children's fears. "I'm not going to get tired of you," he said firmly. "That's a promise. There will be difficult days when we all feel frustrated or overwhelmed, but that doesn't mean anyone is going anywhere." "How do you know?" Ruth asked with 4-year-old logic. "You don't know us very well yet." The honesty of the question forced Marcus to examine his own motivations and commitment. Why had he taken on this responsibility? What made him think he could succeed where the system had expected failure? "You're right," Marcus said carefully. "I don't know you very well yet, and you don't know me. But I do know that families aren't just about how well you know each other. They're about making a commitment to stick together while you figure things out." Elizabeth studied his face with the evaluating gaze she had inherited from her role as protector of her sisters. "What if we're too much trouble? What if we can't follow all your rules, or we make too much noise, or we cost too much money?" The fears tumbling out of Elizabeth revealed the enormous pressure she felt to ensure her sister's security through perfect behavior. Marcus recognized the burden she was carrying because he had felt something similar during his military service. The weight of being responsible for other people's survival. "Elizabeth," Marcus said, "the only rule that really matters is that we treat each other with respect and kindness. Everything else we can work out as we go along. And you're not responsible for making sure your sisters are perfect. That's my job now." The relief that crossed Elizabeth's face was immediately followed by anxiety, as if giving up control was almost as frightening as keeping it. Marcus understood the feeling learning to trust others with responsibilities you had been carrying alone was one of the hardest parts of healing from trauma. That the first week of their life together was a series of small crises and minor victories that tested everyone's patience and adaptability. Meal preparation became a collaborative effort that produced decidedly mixed results. Marcus's attempts at cooking were enthusiastic but unskilled, while Elizabeth's knowledge was limited to the few dishes her mother had taught her before the fire. Their combined efforts produced pancakes that were either burned or raw, meatloaf that could have been used as building material, and vegetables that were cooked until they lost both flavor and nutritional value. But the girls ate everything without complaint, apparently grateful just to have meals that were prepared with care and shared around a table that belonged to them. Bedtime routines proved even more challenging than meals. Ruth was afraid of the dark and required extensive reassurance before she could fall asleep. Catherine had nightmares that woke the entire household, while Sarah sometimes sleepwalked, requiring vigilant monitoring to ensure her safety. Margaret dealt with her grief by reading voraciously, often staying awake far past reasonable bedtimes, because books provided escape from thoughts that were too painful to process. Elizabeth slept poorly because she couldn't quite trust that Marcus would handle emergencies with her sisters, leading to a pattern of hypervigilance that left her exhausted. Marcus found his own sleep disrupted, not just by the children's needs, but by his own nightmares, which seemed to intensify under the stress of his new responsibilities. There were nights when he woke from dreams of Korean combat to find Ruth crawling into his bed because she was afraid, creating a collision between his psychological wounds and his duties as a guardian. But there were also moments of unexpected joy that reminded Marcus why he had made this commitment. Catherine's delighted laughter when he successfully flipped a pancake without dropping it. Margaret's excitement when she discovered that his small collection of books included several volumes she had never read. Sarah's artwork, which began to include pictures of families and homes rather than just fires and destruction. Most significantly, there was the gradual relaxation of Elizabeth's rigid control as she began to trust that Marcus would handle responsibilities she had been carrying alone. The 14-year-old girl who had been forced to become a parent began to remember how to be a child, participating in silly games and allowing herself to depend on adult protection. The practical challenges of their new life together were complicated by Marcus's ongoing struggle with his own psychological recovery. The constant presence of 5 children meant that his carefully developed coping mechanisms for managing war trauma had to be completely revised. The isolation and rigid routines that had helped him maintain emotional stability were no longer possible. Instead, he had to learn to function in the chaos of family life while managing symptoms that could be triggered by unexpected noises, emotional stress, or disrupted sleep patterns. There were episodes when the demands of parenting overwhelmed his psychological defenses, leading to moments of anger or anxiety that frightened both him and the children. During these incidents, Marcus had to quickly implement the crisis management techniques he had learned in his training, removing himself from the situation until he could regain control. The girls learned to recognize the warning signs that Marcus was struggling, developing their own strategies for giving him space when he needed it. Elizabeth proved particularly skilled at redirecting her sister's attention during these moments, demonstrating a maturity that both impressed and saddened Marcus. "Is Mr. Marcus sick like Daddy was sometimes?" Ruth asked Elizabeth one evening, after Marcus had retreated to the porch following a particularly difficult day. "He's not sick," Elizabeth explained carefully. "Sometimes adults have sad feelings from things that happened before, just like we do. He just needs quiet time to feel better." The conversation, overheard through the cabin's thin walls, reminded Marcus that his own healing was connected to the children's recovery. They were all learning to live with loss and trauma, all developing strategies for managing emotions that were sometimes too big to handle alone. The breakthrough in their family dynamics came during the 3rd week when a late spring snowstorm trapped them in the cabin for 3 days. The isolation that Marcus had once craved became a crucible that forced them to function as a genuine family unit rather than a collection of individuals sharing space. With no possibility of outside help or distraction, they had to solve problems together, entertain each other, and navigate conflicts without escape routes. Marcus found himself mediating disputes between sisters, leading impromptu lessons in geography and history, and participating in elaborate games that stretched his imagination in ways it hadn't been challenged since childhood. The storm also created opportunities for deeper conversations about their shared experiences of loss and healing. Sitting around the fireplace while wind rattled the windows, They began to share memories of their previous lives, Marcus's stories of growing up in Ohio, the girls' recollections of their parents and the life they had lost. "Do you miss being alone?" Margaret asked one evening as they played cards by lamplight, the electricity having failed during the storm. Marcus considered the question seriously. "Sometimes," he admitted. "It was easier in some ways, not having to worry about anyone else or explain my bad days. But it was also lonely in ways I didn't realize until you all arrived." "We were lonely too," Catherine said softly. "Even when we were together, we felt lonely because Mama and Daddy weren't there anymore." The conversation revealed a truth that none of them had articulated before, that their family was built on shared loneliness as much as shared love, on the recognition that they all needed each other in ways that went beyond simple practical arrangements. By the end of their first month together, they had developed routines and relationships that felt increasingly natural rather than forced. Marcus had learned to cook basic meals that the girls actually enjoyed, while they had learned to respect his need for quiet time and structured schedules. More importantly, they had begun to trust each other with their vulnerabilities and fears, creating the emotional safety that would allow deeper healing to occur. The broken soldier and 5 orphaned sisters had discovered that their individual wounds could become sources of strength when shared within the context of family love and commitment. The transformation was far from complete. There would be setbacks and challenges ahead that would test every lesson they had learned. But the foundation had been established for something that none of them had expected to find again: a sense of belonging that transcended loss and created new possibilities for the future. 3 months into their life as a family, Marcus thought they had weathered the worst of their adjustment period. The girls had settled into routines. His own psychological episodes were becoming less frequent, and even Mrs. Crawford's monthly visits had taken on a tone of cautious optimism rather than bureaucratic scrutiny. Then came the night that nearly destroyed everything they had built together. It started with what seemed like a minor incident. Sarah had been having trouble sleeping again, her dreams filled with images of fire that sent her wandering through the cabin in the middle of the Kazan night. Marcus had developed a system for handling these episodes: gentle redirection back to bed, a glass of warm milk, sometimes sitting with her until she fell asleep again. But on this particular night in late May, Sarah's sleepwalking took her outside. Marcus woke to find the front door standing open and no sign of the 9-year-old anywhere in the cabin. Elizabeth was already awake, frantically searching the bedrooms while her sisters stirred from sleep, sensing the crisis without understanding what was happening. "She's not in the house," Elizabeth said, her voice tight with the kind of controlled panic that Marcus recognized from his military days. "The door was open when I got up to check on her." Marcus grabbed the flashlight and began searching the immediate area around the cabin, calling Sarah's name into the darkness. The mountain terrain was treacherous even in daylight, with steep drops and rocky outcroppings that could be deadly for a disoriented child wandering in the dark. Catherine began crying when she realized what was happening, her 6-year-old imagination conjuring worst-case scenarios. Ruth wanted to help search but was too young to be left alone, creating a logistical nightmare that highlighted how quickly their carefully constructed family stability could collapse. "Elizabeth, stay with your sisters," Marcus ordered, falling back on military command patterns under stress. "Keep them inside and call down to the Andersons if I'm not back in an hour. Tell them to contact Sheriff Coleman." "I should help you look," Elizabeth protested, her need to protect her sisters warring with her desire to participate in the search. "No," Marcus said firmly. "Your job is to keep the others safe. I need to know they're secure so I can focus on finding Sarah." The search stretched through the longest 2 hours of Marcus's life. He followed every trail and checked every hiding place within a mile of the cabin, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as he called Sarah's name until his voice was hoarse. The forest seemed to swallow his words, offering only the echo of his own desperation in response. He found her just before dawn, curled up in a small cave about a quarter-mile down the mountain, apparently drawn there by some instinct for shelter during her confused wandering. She was cold and scratched from brambles, but physically unharmed. The relief that flooded through Marcus when he saw her small form was so intense it left him shaking. "I got lost," Sarah said simply when he woke her gently. "I was looking for Mama and Daddy, but I couldn't find them." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, revealing the depth of confusion and longing that still drove Sarah's nighttime episodes. Despite months of healing and adjustment, the 9-year-old was still searching for parents who would never return, still hoping that somehow the tragedy that had destroyed her original family could be undone. Marcus carried Sarah back to the cabin, where her sisters waited with a mixture of relief and residual fear. But as the immediate crisis passed, larger problems began to emerge. Elizabeth was furious not at Sarah for wandering off, but at Marcus for what she saw as a failure of protection. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," Elizabeth said, her 14-year-old composure cracking to reveal the terror underneath. "We trusted you to keep us safe, and you almost lost Sarah. What if she had fallen off a cliff? What if we had found her too late?" The accusation was devastating because it echoed Marcus's own fears about his adequacy as a guardian. For months, he had been fighting the voice in his head that insisted he was too damaged, too unreliable, too broken to be responsible for children's welfare. Elizabeth's anger gave that voice credibility it had been lacking. "You're right," Marcus said quietly. "I should have been more careful. I should have anticipated that Sarah might try to leave the cabin during one of her episodes." His admission of fault, rather than diffusing Elizabeth's anger, seemed to make it worse. "Should have, could have, that doesn't help if something terrible happens," she said, her voice rising. "Maybe the state was right. Maybe we should be with real families who know how to take care of children properly." Margaret and Catherine watched this confrontation with wide, frightened eyes, while Ruth clung to Sarah as if afraid she might disappear again. The family unity that had seemed so solid just hours before was fracturing under the pressure of crisis and recrimination. "Elizabeth," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice calm despite the emotional chaos churning inside him, "I understand you're scared. I'm scared too. But families work through problems together. They don't give up on each other when things get difficult. Real families don't almost lose children in the woods," Elizabeth shot back. "Real families have mothers and fathers who know what they're doing." The comparison to real families revealed the depth of Elizabeth's insecurity about their unconventional arrangement. Despite months of positive experiences, she still saw their family as a poor substitute for what they had lost, held together by necessity rather than genuine bonds. The argument might have escalated further, but Sarah intervened. With the devastating honesty that children sometimes display during emotional crises. "I don't want a real family," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the tension in the room. "I want this family. I want to stay here with Mr. Marcus." The simple declaration stopped Elizabeth's tirade, but it also revealed another layer of the crisis they were facing. Sarah's sleepwalking wasn't just about searching for her deceased parents. It was about testing whether this new family would abandon her if she caused too much trouble. Dr. Anderson arrived an hour later, summoned by Marcus's phone call requesting medical evaluation for Sarah's physical condition. But the doctor quickly realized that the psychological wounds opened by the incident were more serious than any scratches or bruises Sarah had sustained during her nighttime wandering. "This kind of regression is normal after trauma," Dr. Anderson explained as he examined Sarah in the cabin's main room. "Children often take steps backward in their healing when they feel overwhelmed or uncertain about their security." "But what triggered it?" Marcus asked. "She's been doing so much better." Her nightmares had almost stopped. Dr. Anderson's expression was thoughtful as he considered the question. Sometimes progress itself can be triggering. As children begin to feel safe and happy in new situations, they also become more aware of what they've lost. The contrast between their current life and their memories can be overwhelming. The explanation provided context for Sarah's behavior, but it didn't resolve the larger crisis that her wandering had created within the family. Elizabeth remained convinced that Marcus's guardianship represented a dangerous experiment that put her sisters at risk, while Marcus found himself questioning whether his own limitations made him unsuitable for the responsibilities he had assumed. The tension came to a head when Mrs. Crawford made her scheduled monthly visit 2 days later. Elizabeth, still angry and frightened by the incident, made a decision that shocked everyone. She asked to speak with the social worker privately about the possibility of alternative placement for herself and her sisters. Marcus waited on the front porch while Elizabeth presented her case inside the cabin, arguing that the near loss of Sarah demonstrated fundamental problems with their current arrangement. He could hear the murmur of conversation, but not the specific words, though Elizabeth's tone suggested she was making her arguments with the same intensity she brought to protecting her sisters. When Mrs. Crawford emerged from the cabin an hour later, her expression was professionally neutral but clearly troubled. "Mr. Sullivan, I need to speak with you about some concerns that have been raised." The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of Marcus's life. Mrs. Crawford had to investigate Elizabeth's complaints thoroughly, exploring whether the incident with Sarah represented a pattern of inadequate supervision that might justify removing the children from his care. "I understand that Elizabeth is frightened," Mrs. Crawford said carefully, "and her concerns aren't entirely unreasonable. Keeping track of 5 children, especially children dealing with trauma responses, is an enormous challenge for anyone." Marcus felt his world beginning to collapse as he realized that 3 months of progress might be undone by a single night's crisis. "I know I made mistakes," he said, "but I'm learning." "We all are. Doesn't that count for something?" "Learning is important," Mrs. Crawford acknowledged, "but the state's primary concern is child safety. If there are ongoing risks that can't be managed—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Marcus understood the implication. The conditional approval that had allowed him to become the girl's guardian could be revoked if their welfare appeared to be in jeopardy. What would happen to them? Marcus asked, though he dreaded the answer. "There are several options," Mrs. Crawford said diplomatically. "The older girls might be placed together with an experienced foster family. The younger ones would probably be placed separately, at least initially. The prospect of the sisters being split up after everything they had been through together felt like a betrayal of everything Marcus had been trying to achieve. But his own feelings were less important than the girls' welfare, and if Elizabeth was right about his inadequacy as a guardian, then perhaps separation was the responsible choice. The crisis deepened when Marcus discovered that the other sisters had learned about Elizabeth's request for alternative placement. Margaret, usually the most diplomatic of the girls, confronted her older sister with an anger that surprised everyone. "How could you try to break up our family without talking to us?" Margaret demanded during dinner that evening. "Don't we get to have a say in what happens to us?" "I'm trying to protect you," Elizabeth replied, her own anger flaring. "All of you. If something happens to one of you because I didn't speak up, how am I supposed to live with that?" Catherine began crying, overwhelmed by the conflict between the 2 sisters she looked up to most. Ruth, too young to fully understand the political dimensions of the argument, simply repeated over and over that she didn't want to leave the mountain. Sarah, whose wandering had triggered the entire crisis, surprised everyone by taking responsibility for the family's turmoil. "It's my fault," she said, her 9-year-old voice carrying enormous weight. "I made everyone scared because I went outside when I wasn't supposed to. But that doesn't mean we should split up." The depth of guilt that Sarah was carrying became clear as she continued. "I thought if I could find Mama and Daddy, then everything would be okay again. But they're not coming back, are they? And if we leave here, we'll lose Mr. Marcus too." The conversation that followed was the most honest and painful the family had shared since coming together. Each sister expressed her fears about their future, her memories of their parents, and her feelings about the unconventional family they had created on Copper Mountain. Elizabeth finally admitted that her anger wasn't really about Marcus's failure to prevent Sarah's wandering. It was about her terror of losing another family after already losing her parents. "I can't go through that again," she said, tears flowing for the first time since the fire. "I can't watch everything fall apart and not be able to stop it." Marcus found himself thinking about his own experience with loss and trauma, about the ways that fear of future pain could prevent people from accepting present happiness. Elizabeth's protective instincts were admirable, but they were also keeping her from fully investing in the family relationships that might heal her deepest wounds. "Elizabeth," Marcus said gently, "there are no guarantees in life about what might happen to the people we love. But that doesn't mean we stop loving them or stop trying to build something good together." The conversation stretched late into the evening, with each family member wrestling with fundamental questions about trust, security, and the courage required to remain vulnerable to people who might leave or disappoint them. By morning, they had reached a tentative agreement to continue working together as a family, but the crisis had revealed fault lines that would require ongoing attention and care. Mrs. Crawford's final evaluation, conducted after extensive interviews with each family member, concluded that while the incident with Sarah represented a serious concern, it didn't justify breaking up a family that was clearly committed to working through their problems together. But she also implemented new requirements for Marcus's guardianship: additional training in child psychology, monthly rather than quarterly check-ins, and a formal safety plan for managing future episodes of Sarah's sleepwalking. The crisis had nearly broken them, but surviving it together had also revealed the depth of their commitment to each other and their willingness to fight for the family they had created against all odds. 2 years after the crisis that nearly tore their family apart, Marcus Sullivan stood on the stage of Pine Ridge Elementary School, watching his youngest daughter Ruth accept a perfect attendance award while her 4 sisters cheered from the audience. The scene would have been unimaginable to the broken soldier who had hidden in a mountain cabin, convinced that he had nothing valuable to offer the world. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't followed the smooth trajectory that anyone might have hoped for. There had been setbacks, breakthrough moments, small victories, and periods of doubt that tested everyone's commitment to the family they were building together. But as Marcus watched Ruth beam with pride while clutching her certificate, he realized that somewhere along the way, they had stopped being an experiment in alternative child placement and had become something much more powerful: a genuine family bound together by love, trust, and shared purpose. The changes in each of the girls were remarkable, but they were subtle enough that Marcus sometimes had to look at old photographs to fully appreciate how far they had all come. Elizabeth, now 16, had grown into a confident young woman who had learned to balance her protective instincts with trust in Marcus's ability to keep her sisters safe. She was considering colleges, something that would have been impossible without the stability and support that their unconventional family provided. Her academic achievements were impressive, but what struck Marcus most was the way Elizabeth had learned to be a teenager rather than a substitute parent. She went to school dances, participated in drama club, and had even started dating a young man named David Parker, whose family farmed in the valley below. The relationship had terrified Marcus initially, but watching Elizabeth navigate the complexities of young love with confidence and good judgment had convinced him that he had somehow managed to raise a daughter capable of making wise decisions. Margaret, at 14, had blossomed into an intellectual powerhouse whose love of reading had expanded into serious academic ambitions. She talked about becoming a teacher or maybe even a college professor, goals that seemed entirely achievable given her intelligence and determination. But more importantly, she had learned to balance her scholarly pursuits with family relationships, often serving as a bridge between her older sister's increasing independence and her younger sister's continuing need for guidance. Catherine, now 8 years old, had developed into the family's social coordinator, maintaining friendships throughout Pine Ridge and serving as an unofficial ambassador for their household. Her outgoing personality and genuine warmth had helped normalize their family within the community, making it easier for people to see them as neighbors rather than curiosities. She played on the local softball team, participated in church activities, and had a gift for making adults feel appreciated and included. Sarah, at 11, had channeled her artistic talents into a passion for storytelling that went far beyond her early trauma processing drawings. She wrote elaborate stories about adventures and heroism, often featuring families that overcame impossible odds through courage and loyalty. Her nightmares had largely disappeared, replaced by dreams that she eagerly shared with anyone willing to listen. The sleepwalking episodes had stopped completely after the implementation of better sleep routines and therapeutic interventions. Ruth, now 6 and starting first grade, had no clear memories of the tragedy that had brought them all together. For her, Marcus had always been Dad, the cabin on Copper Mountain had always been home, and her sisters had always been the center of her world. Her cheerful adaptation to their family life had helped heal wounds that might otherwise have remained open, reminding everyone that children's resilience could transform even the most unlikely circumstances into something beautiful. The changes in Marcus himself were perhaps even more dramatic than the girl's development, though he was often the last person to recognize his own growth. The isolated, psychologically wounded veteran who had retreated to the mountain had gradually evolved into a confident father, whose primary identity was no longer defined by his military service or his trauma, the nightmares that had once dominated. His sleep had become rare occurrences, manageable episodes that no longer disrupted his ability to function as a parent and community member. He still experienced anxiety and occasional bouts of depression related to his war experiences, but these symptoms no longer controlled his life or limited his relationships with others. More significantly, Marcus had discovered talents and interests that had been buried beneath his psychological wounds. His work with the girls had revealed a natural ability for teaching and mentoring that had expanded beyond his own family. He had become involved in veteran support groups, sharing his story with other former soldiers who were struggling with the transition to civilian life. His success as a single father had made him something of a local celebrity within veteran communities throughout West Virginia. Other men who had given up on the possibility of normal family life sought his advice about overcoming trauma and building meaningful relationships. Marcus found himself regularly speaking at VFW meetings in veterans' hospitals, sharing the lessons he had learned about healing through service to others. The cabin on Copper Mountain had evolved as dramatically as its inhabitants. What had begun as a cramped bachelor retreat had been expanded and improved multiple times, becoming a comfortable family home that reflected the personalities and interests of all its residents. Elizabeth had her own study space for college preparation. Margaret had built-in bookshelves that lined an entire wall. Catherine had a room bright with posters and sports equipment. Sarah had an art corner with proper lighting and storage for her supplies. And Ruth had a play area that could accommodate the constant stream of toys and games that 6-year-olds require. The property itself had been transformed from a hermit's hideaway into a working homestead that provided both practical benefits and therapeutic activities for the entire family. They raised chickens for eggs, maintained a large vegetable garden that supplied much of their food, and had even acquired a small herd of goats that had become everyone's favorite chores. The work required to maintain their mountain homestead had taught all the girls valuable lessons about responsibility, self-reliance, and the satisfaction that comes from productive labor. More importantly, it had given them a shared project that reinforced their identity as a family unit capable of creating something valuable together. The Pine Ridge community had also been transformed by the success of Marcus's unconventional family. What had begun as a charitable effort to help 5 orphan children had evolved into a broader recognition that traditional definitions of family might be too narrow to address the complex needs of modern society. Other single adults in the community had been inspired by Marcus's example to consider foster care or adoption, leading to the placement of several other children who might otherwise have been institutionalized or placed far from their home community. The local churches had developed formal support networks for non-traditional families, providing resources and assistance that made alternative placements more viable. Dr. Anderson had documented the girl's psychological recovery and Marcus's successful adaptation to fatherhood, contributing to professional literature about trauma, treatment, and family formation that was being read by social workers and psychologists throughout the region. Their story had become a case study in the potential for healing relationships to address problems that conventional therapeutic approaches had failed to resolve. Mrs. Crawford, whose initial skepticism about the placement had given way to enthusiastic support, had used their success to advocate for more flexible approaches to child welfare within the state bureaucracy. She regularly brought other social workers to visit the mountain homestead, demonstrating that unconventional families could provide exceptional care when properly supported and supervised. The academic achievements of all 5 girls had attracted attention from educators who were interested in understanding how traumatized children could thrive in supportive environments. Margaret's scholarly accomplishments were particularly noteworthy, as she had not only caught up with her grade level despite months of disrupted education, but had actually exceeded expectations for students her age. Elizabeth's college preparation had been supported by scholarships and mentorship programs specifically designed for students from non-traditional families, opening doors that might have remained closed if the sisters had been placed in separate foster homes. Her success was inspiring other young people from difficult backgrounds to pursue higher education despite the obstacles they faced. The extended community support that had made their family possible had also created lasting changes in Pine Ridge itself. The cooperation that had emerged during the cabin construction project had led to other collaborative efforts that strengthened community bonds and improved local resources. Chief Wilson had organized a volunteer emergency response team that provided faster assistance to isolated homesteads throughout the mountain region. The success of this program had saved several lives and had attracted state funding for improved communications equipment and training. William Preston had expanded his general store to include educational supplies and children's items, responding to the increased number of families that had been attracted to Pine Ridge by its reputation for community support. The economic activity generated by population growth had brought new businesses and services to the area. The churches had developed youth programs and family support services that addressed problems beyond emergency child placement, creating a social safety net that made the entire community more resilient in the face of future crises. As Marcus reflected on these broader changes while watching Ruth receive her award, he realized that their family's success had created ripple effects that extended far beyond Copper Mountain. The broken soldier who had thought he had nothing to contribute had become a catalyst for transformation that affected dozens of families and an entire community. But the most profound changes were personal rather than public, visible only to those who knew the family intimately. Marcus had learned that healing was not about returning to who he had been before trauma, but about becoming someone new who could integrate difficult experiences into a meaningful life story. The girls had discovered that family was not defined by biology or tragedy, but by the daily choice to support and care for each other through all of life's challenges and celebrations. They had learned that love was not diminished by loss, but could actually be strengthened by the conscious decision to remain open to new relationships despite the risk of future pain. Elizabeth's graduation speech the following spring captured the essence of what their family had accomplished together. standing before an audience that included not just Pine Ridge residents, but visitors who had come to hear about their remarkable story. She spoke about the difference between being rescued and being empowered. "When our parents died," Elizabeth said, her voice strong and clear, "people wanted to rescue us from our tragedy. They wanted to save us from the pain and difficulty of our situation. But what Dad gave us wasn't rescue. It was the opportunity to participate in our own recovery, to help build something new rather than just passively accepting whatever others thought was best for us." She paused, looking directly at Marcus, who was sitting in the front row with tears streaming down his face. He didn't try to replace what we had lost or pretend that our family was just like everyone else's. Instead, he helped us discover that different could be just as good, that families created by choice and commitment could be just as strong as families created by chance and biology. The speech received a standing ovation, but the words that moved Marcus most came during the private family celebration that evening. As they sat around the dinner table that had become the center of their home life, Ruth asked a question that demonstrated how completely their unconventional beginning had been transformed into something natural and permanent. "Dad," she said, using the title that had gradually replaced Mr. Marcus over the years, "when I grow up and have children of my own, will you teach them how to take care of chickens like you taught us?" The question assumed a future that extended far beyond the immediate concerns that had once dominated their family discussions. Ruth was imagining herself as an adult with children of her own, and Marcus as a grandfather who would pass down practical skills and family traditions to another generation. "Of course I will," Marcus replied, his voice thick with emotion. "That's what grandparents are for." Margaret looked up from the college brochures she had been studying. "And I'll make sure they know all the best books to read, just like you. Made sure I had access to good literature." Catherine added, "And I'll teach them how to play softball and make friends with everyone in town." Sarah smiled as she sketched in her ever-present notebook. "I'll tell them stories about how our family began, about how sometimes the best things come from the most unexpected places." Elizabeth, now poised to leave for college in the fall, but still deeply connected to the family that had shaped her teenage years, spoke with the wisdom of someone who had learned to see their story in its proper perspective. "I'll make sure they understand that families aren't just about blood relations or perfect circumstances," she said. "They're about people who choose to stay together and work through problems and celebrate successes and never give up on each other, no matter what." As Marcus listened to his daughter's plan for futures that included him as a permanent part of their lives, he realized that the transformation was complete. The broken soldier who had once said he was too damaged to contribute anything meaningful to the world had become the foundation of a family that would influence generations to come. The young man who had retreated to Copper Mountain in despair had discovered that healing was possible not through isolation, but through connection. The veteran who had carried the weight of military failures had learned that success could be measured not by preventing all problems, but by facing challenges with courage and support from people who cared about the outcome. Most importantly, the man who had once believed that his war trauma made him unsuitable for normal relationships had discovered that his understanding of pain and recovery actually made him uniquely qualified to help others heal from their own wounds. As the evening wound down and the girls prepared for bed with the easy familiarity of a family that had shared thousands of such moments, Marcus stepped outside onto the porch that overlooked the lights of Pine Ridge below. The view was the same as it had been on the night he first heard the sirens that led him to 5 orphaned children, but everything else about his life had been transformed. The broken soldier was gone, replaced by a father, a community leader, an advocate for healing, and a living example of the possibility that even the most unlikely circumstances could produce extraordinary outcomes when approached with courage, commitment, and love. The story that had begun with tragedy and isolation had become a testament to the power of human connection to transform pain into purpose, loss into renewal, and individual wounds into collective strength. 5 orphaned sisters had indeed made him their hero, but in the process, they had discovered that they were heroes themselves, capable of creating family, community, and hope from the ashes of everything they had lost. The lights of Pine Ridge twinkled below like stars, each one representing a life that had been touched in some way by the ripple effects of their unlikely family success. And on Copper Mountain, 6 people who had found each other in their darkest moments continued to build a future that proved every day that broken things could be made whole, that lost children could find homes, and that heroes were not born, but made through this simple choice to care for others even when caring required everything you had to give. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.